That morning at JFK, the terminal pulsed with the usual rush of travelers, rolling suitcases, shouts of gate changes, boarding calls echoing under bright fluorescent lights. All of it snapped to silence with a single, startling bang. An elderly woman's cane skittered across the tiled floor, its echo sharp enough to hush the crowd. Pale blue eyes flew open in surprise as she shielded herself. Towering above her in crisp uniform stood Flight Attendant Caroline Whitmore, badge gleaming, voice cold as she pointed toward the gate. "I told you to step aside. First class is not for people like you." Harriet Washington did not scream. She did not stumble. With deliberate grace, she bent to reclaim her carved wooden cane, rising into a posture of calm defiance, her shoulders squared, her back straight. Every inch the woman who had built her life on resilience. "You've just made a serious mistake," she said, voice soft but carrying. It was the same voice that had guided boardrooms and lecture halls, steady, undeterred, a warning dressed in civility. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances as Harriet met Caroline's glare. The overhead announcements droned on, flight delays, gate changes. Yet here at Gate 22, everything felt suspended. Harriet's deep brown eyes shone with quiet authority. In her emerald green jacket and simple pearl earrings, she looked every bit the distinguished professional she was. No amount of impatience from a uniform could tarnish that. Moments later, Julia Monroe appeared, striding toward the opposite end of the gate. Her blonde bun and perfectly tailored uniform spoke of strict standards and polished appearances. She carried a clipboard like a shield and wore entitlement like perfume. Distracted by passenger lists, she collided with Harriet so sharply the cane quivered in her hand. Julia's blue eyes narrowed as she surveyed Harriet's modest attire and ebony skin. "Please step aside," Julia snapped, gaze flicking condescendingly over Harriet. "This is for first-class passengers." Harriet tipped her chin, never breaking eye contact. "I know exactly where I belong," she answered quietly, each word precise. A hush fell as onlookers realized this was no ordinary tiff but a quiet stand against something far uglier. Prejudice was at work here, clear and unashamed. Julia's lips pressed into a thin line, her face tightened, prejudice bubbling to the surface. With one swift motion, she lunged for Harriet's boarding pass. Instinctively, Harriet jerked her hand back. Frustration turned to fury in Julia's eyes. Before anyone could stop her, she raised her hand and slapped Harriet's cane, hand and all, so hard it sounded like a pistol shot. The cane clattered to the marble floor as if shamed. Passengers jumped. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Harriet's jaw tightened, a flash of pain crossing her face before she folded it back into that familiar mask of composure. She bent slowly, retrieved her cane, then straightened with deliberate slowness, as though etching the moment into everyone's memory. Julia squared her shoulders and raised her voice, making sure every ear heard. "This area is for true first-class passengers, Harriet Washington. People like you do not belong here." Her tone dripped contempt, as though Harriet had no right to occupy air that cost hundreds of dollars to breathe. The crowd's reaction was a mix of horror and shame. Sebastian Hartley, a young executive off to a meeting, gripped his phone in one hand, unsure if he should intervene or simply record what he'd witnessed. Abigail Miller covered her mouth, tears brimming at the injustice. But Harriet Washington said nothing. She merely raised her chin, pressed her lips into a determined line, and let the silence speak louder than words. In that silence, the terminal seemed to shift. Car alarms across town might have roared less insistently. Harriet's stillness carried more weight than Julia's outburst. The carved handle of her cane felt warm against her palm, a reminder of every barrier she had ever overcome. The mutters grew behind her, sympathy, outrage, solidarity. And through it all, Harriet stood as steady as a lighthouse in storm-tossed seas. That confrontation was only the beginning. Harriet Washington felt the old fire flare within her. She knew that soon she would demand not just respect, but accountability. And when she did, everyone in JFK International would understand that no badge, no uniform, no prejudice would ever force her back into the shadows again. In the moments after Julia's slap, the terminal seemed to hold its breath. Harriet Washington felt the heat of humiliation rise in her cheeks, but she did not stagger or cry out. Instead, she planted her feet shoulder-thin apart, the carved handle of her cane steady in her hand. Around her, whispers swelled into a low roar of outrage. It was in that charged silence that Harriet made her decision. She would not walk away quietly. She raised her voice just enough that security officers 2 gates down could hear her calm demand. 2 burly officers in Navy uniforms approached swiftly, their radios crackling. Julia Monroe straightened her posture, chest puffed, as if daring them to side with Harriet. "Ma'am," the taller officer said, addressing Harriet with polite formality, "we need to ask you and this flight attendant over to customer relations for statements." Harriet nodded, cane tapping softly on the marble. She turned to Julia with a measured look. "You might come along too," she said. "I have a few questions for you." In customer relations, under the muted hue of fluorescent lights and the faint scent of coffee, Harriet recounted every detail to the manager, Mr. Alvarez. She spoke slowly, deliberately, leaving no room for misunderstanding. She described the bang of her cane hitting the floor like a gunshot, the way Julia's blue eyes gleamed with contempt, the harsh echo of "people like you do not belong here." Every word carried the weight of decades of dignity and determination. Mr. Alvarez's face flushed. His jaw worked as he offered apologies that rang hollow. "I accept your apology," Harriet said softly. "But it is not enough. I want this to count for something. I want a formal statement on your company letterhead acknowledging the prejudice I experienced. I want Julia Monroe to undergo unconscious bias training. I want all first-class staff to attend sensitivity workshops." She paused, leaning on her cane. "And I want to know what steps you will take to ensure no one else is subjected to this treatment." Mr. Alvarez swallowed and glanced at his colleagues clustered behind him. Already the news of the incident had trickled out. Someone had recorded Julia's slap on their phone. In the digital age, an injustice on Gate 22 could become a national headline in under an hour. "Of course, Ms. Washington," he stammered. "We will draft the statement within 24 hours. Ms. Monroe will be suspended pending retraining, and we will institute monthly seminars for all our staff." Harriet nodded, then asked for a copy of the security camera footage. By the time Harriet boarded her flight that afternoon, she had already issued a brief statement through her company's public relations department. Her words were simple but resolute. No one should ever be judged or treated differently because of their race or age. I stand for dignity and respect. Within 2 hours, the video of Julia's slap and Harriet's composed response had racked up over 1 million views across social media. Dignity at JFK began climbing trending lists, and calls for a boycott of the airline poured in. Under mounting public pressure, the airline released an official apology video the next morning. The CEO, looking contrite, admitted that the incident fell far below our standards of service and respect. Julia Monroe's name was mentioned directly as the employee involved. The statement announced her indefinite suspension and a full review of her conduct. Caroline Whitmore, the attendant who had confronted Harriet earlier, was also placed on leave pending investigation. It was the first time the airline had ever named staff in a public apology. Meanwhile, Julia Monroe faced an internal disciplinary hearing. Colleagues who once admired her polished professionalism now saw her arrogance laid bare. She lost her coveted quarterly bonus, her annual performance review was marked unsatisfactory, and her health benefits were suspended until she completed the retraining program. Photographs of her slap, once just an airport skirmish, had become evidence of deep-seated bias that the public would not tolerate. Julia's career, built on privilege and entitlement, began to unravel. Harriet Washington, for her part, used the compensation she secured from the airline not for personal gain but to endow a scholarship at a local community college in Queens, funding studies for adult learners pursuing careers in hospitality. In conjunction with a New York civil rights group, she held a press conference at the college campus 2 days later. Standing on a portable podium beneath fluttering state flags, Harriet addressed reporters with the same calm firmness she'd shown at the gate. "Respect is not a luxury reserved for the few," she said. "It is a fundamental right for us all." Applause rippled across the small crowd. In the week that followed, the airline's stock dipped by nearly 2% as travelers questioned its culture and leadership. Opposing airlines seized the moment to highlight their own diversity training programs. Julia Monroe's name trended on professional networking sites, with posts dissecting her actions and debating whether someone with her record belonged in customer service at all. She issued a brief apology of her own. "I deeply regret my actions." But the public had grown weary of hollow words. On a late-apile afternoon, Harriet returned to JFK for a booked flight home. As she approached Gate 22, a small group of strangers waited. One woman held a sign reading, "You belong here." A young man gave Harriet a bouquet of daisies, saying, "I'm sorry you had to go through that, ma'am." The gate agent, whom Harriet had met the day before, quietly escorted her to the jet bridge, opening a velvet rope that marked the entrance to first class. Passengers peered curiously as Harriet strolled past, cane tapping gently, her shoulders set with quiet triumph. Settling into her seat, Harriet looked out at the runway, where planes taxied at roughly 15 miles per hour, bound for destinations coast to coast. She wrapped her scarf more snugly around her neck, soft wool in a shade of royal blue, and closed her eyes for a moment. It had been a week unlike any other, but through it all she had held fast to her dignity. When the engines rumbled to life and the plane lifted into the clear spring sky, Harriet allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Justice, she knew, was not just a word. It was a stand taken in a crowded terminal under fluorescent lights. And for Harriet Washington, it was only the beginning. Harriet Washington's quiet words still hung in the air like thunder when the overhead speaker crackled to life, announcing first-class boarding. She straightened her spine, the carved handle of her cane pressing gently into her palm, its weight a reminder of everything she'd endured and overcome. Around her, the crowd shifted, their curiosity intensifying as they watched flight attendant Julia Monroe stride forward, lips pressed into a tight line. Julia stood directly in Harriet's path at the gate entrance, arms crossed and gaze icy. She pulled out a small scanner and pointed it at Harriet. "Excuse me, ma'am, I need to scan your ticket again," she said, her tone sharp. "It seems you have not complied with my request." Harriet looked at the scanner, then back at Julia, her expression calm but firm. "By all means," she replied softly. She reached into the pocket of her tailored sapphire coat and withdrew her ticket from its leather holder. The edges of the paper were crisp, the gold foil glinting under the airport lights. She extended it toward Julia, every movement deliberate, measured. Julia seized the ticket with a short, impatient motion. She held it too close to her face, as though Harriet's identity might erupt from the print. Her green eyes darted over the information. Seat 1A, first class. JFK to LX. "Harriet," she began, then paused as the name sank in. A crackle of tension spread through the nearby passengers. A middle-aged man in a lavender sweater clutched his briefcase tighter. A young couple exchanged looks, phones at the ready. Even the gate agent behind Julia straightened, sensing that something far bigger than a boarding dispute was unfolding. Julia's voice wavered. She tried to maintain her authority, but her tone slipped. "Miss Washington," she said, keying the scanner. "Everything appears to be in order." She paused, her gaze flicking to the watching crowd as though looking for support. Finding none, she cleared her throat. "You may proceed." Harriet lifted her chin, cane tapping softly on the floor as she passed. Every step she took echoed across the polished marble, 14 inches of heel-striking stone, commanding respect. She walked with the grace of a woman who had navigated boardrooms and lecture halls, who had faced prejudice and refused to bow. She moved past Julia as if she were a mere shadow at the edge of her path. But Harriet did not leave the confrontation behind. She paused just beyond the rope that marked the entrance to first class. Turning slowly so that all eyes remained on her, she leaned lightly on her cane and addressed Julia in a voice clear enough for everyone to hear. "Miss Monroe, you should know that one's worth is not measured by the shape of one's purse or the color of one's skin." She allowed a small, controlled smile to touch her lip, measured by integrity, by dignity, and by the respect we afford to others. The words struck Julia like a physical blow. Her cheeks flushed crimson, her shoulders tensed. Around them a ripple of affirmation passed through the passengers. Soft murmurs of agreement, sympathetic nods, the click of smartphones capturing the moment. Julia's mouth opened, then closed, her carefully constructed facade crumbling in the face of Harriet's composed condemnation. I apologize for the misunderstanding," Julia stammered, eyes flicking between Harriet and the gathering onlookers. "I was only following protocol." Harriet's gaze remained steady. "Protocol does not justify prejudice," she replied. "I expect that not only will your management review this incident, but that you personally will attend cultural competence training. This is not optional." She turned her head, eyes sweeping the crowd, as if to draw in every witness to her verdict. "I also expect an official apology, not just from Ms. Monroe, but from the airline itself." The gate agent, now regaining his voice, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry for any distress," he said, his tone respectful. "We will have our corporate offices issue a formal apology. We will document the incident, and Miss Monroe will undergo retraining immediately." Harriet inclined her head. "Thank you. That is a start." She paused, gathering the full weight of the moment. "But let the record show that dignity is non-negotiable. Respect is not a privilege reserved for the wealthy. It is a right granted to every human being." With that, she straightened fully, placed her ticket back into its holder, and moved through the rope into first class. A wave of applause swept behind her. Phones clicked, cameras flashed. Julia Monroe shrank back, her uniform crisp but her spirit visibly bent. Harriet's victory was not delivered by force or fury, but by unassailable calm, by a willingness to stand her ground when every instinct urged her to retreat. Once aboard, Harriet settled into seat 1A, adjusting the silver scarf at her collar. The flight attendants offered her a complimentary glass of champagne, but she shook her head. Instead, she asked for a bottle of water, ice cold, and kept her gaze fixed on the runway. Outside, a gleaming aircraft waited, engines humming at 15 miles per hour on the taxiway. Inside, Harriet reflected on how quickly a moment of injustice could become a moment of collective awakening. But the story did not end there. Word had traveled fast. Within the hour, the video of Julia's confrontation and Harriet's composed response had spread across social media under the hashtag #DignityAndSky. News outlets ran it as a feel-good story of a woman who refused to be silenced. The airline's stock wavered as commentators praised Harriet's resolve and condemned Julia's bias. An online petition calling for better training for all flight attendants gathered tens of thousands of signatures in less than a day. Meanwhile, Julia Monroe found herself under intense scrutiny. Her supervisor placed her on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. Colleagues who once admired her now whispered behind her back about her arrogance. She watched videos of Harriet's calm rebuke over and over, each replay a reminder of how quickly entitlement can shatter. For Harriet Washington, however, the incident was never about personal retribution. It was about shining a light on prejudice and showing that even in the corridors of privilege, justice can prevail. During the 12-hour flight, she drafted an op-ed which she would submit to major newspapers upon landing. She wrote about the strength it takes to maintain one's dignity under attack, about the quiet power of composure, and about the responsibility we all share to confront injustice, no matter how small or how large. By the time the plane touched down in Los Angeles, Harriet's piece was circulating in draft form among editors. Calls poured in from civil rights organizations, inviting her to speak at events. Even travel bloggers praised her courage, dubbing her the Queen of First Class. Yet to Harriet, the real triumph lay in the testimonies of ordinary passengers who approached her after the flight, tears in their eyes, thanking her for standing up not just for herself, but for them, for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. As she deplaned, Harriet paused at the top of the jet bridge and looked back at the cabin. A flight attendant offered to carry her bag, but she shook her head, lifting the leather satchel herself. She tapped her cane 3 times on the metal walkway, a signal that resonated with authority. Then she turned and walked into the terminal, shoulders back, head high. Late that afternoon, in a quiet corner of the airport conference center, Harriet delivered a keynote address to airline executives. She told them that trust is earned in small moments of respect. She spoke of the ripple effect a single act can have on corporate culture. She challenged them to re-examine policies, to train employees not only in safety, but in empathy. She closed by saying, "You may think first class is defined by legroom and service tiers, but true first class is defined by how you treat every soul who steps through your doors." Executives applauded, but it was the applause of conviction, not mere politeness. They understood that Harriet Washington had offered them a chance to transform a moment of failure into an opportunity for growth. That night, every major network aired segments of her speech. Interviews with her went viral. The airline issued a public statement detailing new training programs, new accountability measures, and a renewed commitment to diversity and inclusion. For Julia Monroe, the consequences were swift. She was reassigned to customer service on the ground. Her uniform changed from crisp whites to a standard agent's jacket. She wrote letters of apology, underwent bias training, and spent months rebuilding trust. But the experience had forever altered her perspective. Arrogance gave way to humility, and prejudice yielded to understanding of how damaging a single moment of cruelty can be. And for Harriet Washington, life moved forward with new purpose. She established a scholarship fund for hospitality workers, partnered with civil rights groups to develop empathy training modules, and continued speaking out against everyday injustice. Yet she never forgot the hush that fell in Gate 22 when she stood her ground. She carried that silence with her as a reminder that dignity demands to be heard. At home that evening, Harriet poured herself a glass of water, placed her cane by the front door, and settled into her favorite armchair. She closed her eyes, listening to the soft hum of the city beyond her window. She reflected on the events of the day and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She had faced disdain at 90 miles per hour on a crowded tarmac and converted it into a call for respect that would reverberate far beyond the terminal walls. And as she drifted into a well-earned rest, she knew that in the sky, as in life, the measure of a person is found in their courage to stand tall. The moment Julia Monroe ripped the ticket into pieces, the entire boarding gate froze. Fragments of the printed card fluttered onto the polished marble floor like insult hurled into the air. A hush fell, broken only by Julia's ragged breath as she stared at the torn scraps in her hand. Around her, eyes of anger, sympathy, and disbelief flashed among the gathered travelers. No one moved. Each person's phone hovered at the ready, cameras trained on the escalating scene. Harriet Washington stood silent amid the whirlwind, her posture unbroken, her gaze steady as steel. Harriet's lips curved into a half-smile of pity rather than fury. Her brown eyes, clear and deep, reflected a hurt that cut deeper than any slap or insult. She lifted her chin just enough to meet Julia's frantic stare. "Miss Monroe," Harriet began, voice soft yet carrying through the charged silence, "your suspicion is not only baseless, but cruel. You have publicly humiliated me in front of 200 passengers. Do you understand the gravity of what you have done?" Julia's face burned red. She opened her mouth to reply, but only a harsh cough emerged. The standoff that had begun over a boarding pass had transformed into a spectacle of prejudice laid bare. Around them, whispers turned to murmurs of outrage. A woman in a red coat shook her head in disbelief. A man in a three-piece suit fidgeted, arms folded across his chest. Even the children milling about sensed the tension and drew close to their parent. Harriet allowed a long moment before speaking again. She let the frustration, the shock, the collective eyes upon her all play out. Then she spoke with calm authority. "You have accused me of fraud. You have stripped me of my dignity. You have torn a ticket I earned fairly. Yet here I stand, still offering you the courtesy to correct your error?" She paused for effect, letting her words settle like stones dropped in water. "I believe an apology is owed." Julia's shoulders slumped. Her eyes flicked to the crumpled ticket pieces. A tremor ran through her hand, and for the first time, the facade of icy control cracked. She opened her mouth to speak, lips quivering. Then a new sound cut through the tension. Rapid footsteps on tile. A tall man in a crisp black suit strode into view, his expression solemn but commanding. He was Richard Montgomery, senior manager of Infleet Services, and second only to the CEO in authority. Every head turned at his appearance. His gaze swept the scene with practiced calm. He saw the torn ticket at Julia's feet, the trembling attendant, and, most importantly, Harriet's poised stance. He bowed his head slightly in a gesture of respect uncommon among airline executives. "Mrs. Washington," he said, voice deep and earnest, "I extend my sincerest apologies on behalf of this airline. The behavior you have endured is unacceptable and does not reflect our values." A collective exhale rippled through the onlookers. Harriet's shoulders relaxed minutely, but she remained vigilant. Richard continued, "Miss Monroe," he addressed Julia directly, "you will join me in the office for a full debrief. We will document the incident in writing, you will undergo immediate sensitivity and bias training, and you will apologize to Mrs. Washington formally, in writing and in person." Julia's eyes filled with tears. Tears not of regret so much as the shock of consequence. She nodded, unable to speak. Richard turned back to Harriet, offering his arm in a courteous gesture. "Mrs. Washington, if you will allow me, I would like to escort you to your seat." Harriet inclined her head, then reached for her cane. As she moved, passengers parted respectfully, offering sympathetic smiles and apologetic nods. Once seated in 1A, Harriet looked out the window at the line of jets stretching toward the runway. Her heart still pounded with the rush of adrenaline, but a deeper satisfaction settled in her chest. She had endured humiliation and prejudice, yet she had remained dignified and emerged victorious not by force, but by unbreakable composure. She straightened her pearls and smoothed her sapphire scarf, signals of her unshakable grace. Meanwhile, in the terminal, Julia stood alongside Richard in a small office adjacent to the gate. The door closed softly behind them. Inside, she stood rigid, avoiding his eyes. He placed a fresh boarding pass on the desk, untouched by torn fragments. "Ms. Washington has been delayed by this incident, but she insists she still boards this flight," he said, voice gentle but firm. "You will present this ticket to her personally and apologize for every moment of cruelty you inflicted." Julia swallowed, her throat dry as desert sand. She nodded and wrote a letter on personalized airline stationery. Her hand shook as she composed each sentence. Apology, acknowledgement of wrongdoing, promise to learn. When finished, she sealed the envelope and placed it carefully in her pocket. She had never felt so small in her entire career. Back on the plane, Harriet sensed a shift in energy. The cabin crew offered sincere smiles and passengers gave respectful bows of the head. The flight attendants moved with extra attentiveness, offering blankets and refreshments. Harriet accepted a cup of chamomile tea, its warmth soothing her nerves. She stirred in 3 teaspoons of honey, remembering that after the storm she would repose in comfort. The engines roared to life and the plane began its taxi. Harriet watched the runway lights blur into motion as the jet lifted into the spring sky. She closed her eyes and allowed herself a brief moment of triumph. She had turned a moment of blatant racism into a catalyst for genuine change, an apology, new training protocols, and broader awareness. Her cause had touched the hearts of ordinary travelers and moved an entire airline's leadership. Upon landing in Los Angeles, Harriet stepped off the plane into a corridor of soft applause. A few passengers clapped politely, others offered heartfelt gratitude. In the terminal's grand arrivals hall, local news crews awaited. Harriet held her cane firmly. She wore a simple smile, and she spoke into the camera. Today, dignity prevailed. Today we reminded the world that respect is a universal right. Our differences enrich us, not divide us. Her words resonated across broadcasts, fueling conversations in living rooms and boardrooms alike. The airline's CEO appeared live for an interview the next morning, affirming the new policies Richard Montgomery had initiated overnight. Julia Monroe was featured in a training seminar footage, humbly sharing lessons learned. Caroline Whitmore, the attendant who had begun this ordeal with scorn, was also present, apologizing and pledging to advocate for empathy in every future interaction. In the weeks that followed, Harriet Washington received invitations to speak at civil rights conferences, women's forums, and corporate leadership retreats. She accepted some, politely declined others. Her schedule was busy writing an essay on everyday justice for a prominent magazine. She established the Washington Foundation for Respectful Service, providing grants for diversity training in industries beyond aviation, hospitality, healthcare, retail. Yet even amid the accolades, Harriet remained grounded. She often recalled the sharp crack of her cane in the crowded terminal, the hush that fell when she reclaimed her dignity, and the tremor in Julia's voice when confronted by the senior manager's apology. Those memories reminded her that prejudice still lurked, that courage mattered, and that a single person's resolve could ignite a ripple of change. One afternoon, several months later, Harriet returned to JFK, not as a passenger, but as the keynote speaker at the airline's annual summit. The grand ballroom was filled with executives, flight attendants, and ground crew members. She took the stage beneath a banner reading, "Courage, Compassion, Change." She spoke of the power of protocol when guided by empathy, of the necessity of accountability, and the simple truth that a smiling greeting could save a heart from despair. After her speech, she mingled privately with employees who had undergone the new training. They shared stories of how they now noticed unconscious biases among themselves. They described how they felt empowered to apologize, to listen, and to treat every passenger, regardless of income or appearance, with genuine humanity. Harriet felt a swell of pride, knowing her ordeal had become more than a viral video. It was a blueprint for respect. Meanwhile, Julia Monroe had rebuilt her career, slowly earning back trust step by step. She volunteered to lead peer-to-peer workshops, sharing her story of failure and growth. She discovered that true professionalism was not measured by flawless performance, but by the capacity to learn from mistakes and to treat every person with kindness. She and Harriet spoke on a panel together, a symbol of reconciliation and progress. Harriet never ceased to advocate for justice. She wrote op-eds on racism in unexpected places, from grocery store checkouts to school principals' offices. She mentored young women facing discrimination in their workplaces. She traveled to small airports across the country, meeting with crews and encouraging them to pledge respect for all. Her message was always the same: dignity is non-negotiable. And in every airport terminal she passed through, Harriet lifted her head, looked each uniformed attendant in the eye, and gave the most sincere smile she could muster. It was a smile that said, "Thank you for your service," and a reminder that kindness and respect travel further than any plane ever could. Harriet Washington felt the weight of every eye at Gate 22 as the senior manager approached, his polished black shoes clicking sharply on the airport tile. Julia Monroe stood frozen, lips parted and color drained from her cheeks. The moment felt suspended, as though the entire terminal had come to a standstill to witness this reckoning. Harriet's pulse thrummed in her ears, but her posture remained unshaken, cane in hand and heart firm. Richard Montgomery came to a stop just beyond the rope. He took in the torn ticket fragments on the floor, the trembling flight attendant, and finally met Harriet's gaze with unmistakable respect. The change in his usual stern expression revealed more than policy ever could. His voice echoed clearly across the hushed crowd. "Miss Monroe, I cannot fathom what possessed you to insult the chairwoman and CEO of this airline, the very person who built this company from the ground up." His tone was neither angry nor mocking, but carried the weight of authority that brooked no excuse. Gasps rippled through the passengers. Harriet realized that in that single sentence, Richard had revealed her identity. Her pulse slowed as she sensed the shift in the crowd's energy from curiosity to admiration. A murmur of astonishment rose like a wave. People nudged each other, cameras flashed, phones recorded. Sebastian Hartley, still leaning against the wall, felt his mouth drop open. He had suspected Harriet was no ordinary traveler, but this revelation surpassed his wildest expectations. Julia's knees gave way and she sank to one heel, her uniform immaculate but her spirit in tatters. Her eyes, once icy with contempt, now brimmed with tears of shame. She clenched and unclenched her fists, her mouth opening to speak, but only a choked sound came out. Around her, the passengers exchanged expressions of disbelief and outrage. One well-dressed woman patted her husband's arm, whispering, "I had no idea." A businessman in loafers shook his head, phone still recording the dramatic moment. Harriet studied Julia with calm pity. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a sorrow for the wasted potential of a young woman trapped by her own prejudice. She raised one hand, tapping the carved handle of her cane once on the marble floor. "Miss Monroe," she said softly but firmly, her words carrying across the terminal. "Publicly accusing me of fraud, ripping my ticket, and humiliating me before hundreds of paying customers is not protocol. It is cruelty born of bias." She paused. "I accept no apology less than a full acknowledgement of your wrongdoing and your commitment to change." Richard Montgomery inclined his head. "That will happen, Mrs. Washington," he said. Then he turned to Julia, voice businesslike. "Please come with me to the cockpit. We need you to speak with Captain Reynolds and Vice President Caldwell." At his words, Julia's face crumpled further. She rose shakily, wiping at her tears, and followed the manager, each step heavy with dread. Members of the cabin crew parted respectfully, allowing the two to pass. Harriet watched, feeling a pang of compassion despite the injustice she had endured. Moments later, the cockpit door slid open. Julia entered, accompanied by a discreet security officer. Harriet could hear the low, urgent tones of the conversation, a stern voice demanding answers, Julia's tremulous responses. She imagined the scene: Captain Reynolds, tall and authoritative, arms crossed; Stephen Caldwell, the vice president, leaning forward, silver hair catching the fluorescent light. Their expressions would have mirrored the outrage of the terminal. Inside the cockpit, Caldwell's tone cut through the tense air. "Ms. Monroe, do you realize that your actions were not only unprofessional but constituted blatant racial discrimination?" he asked. Julia's head bowed. She looked up, eyes glassy with regret. I was wrong," she stammered. "I let my prejudices cloud my judgment. I humiliated Mrs. Washington, and I am truly sorry." Caldwell's gaze remained stern, but the hardness softened slightly. "Your apology comes far too late to erase the damage, but it is a necessary first step. We will convene an urgent disciplinary hearing after this flight. You are suspended indefinitely." Back in the cabin, Harriet felt a wave of relief and vindication. Passengers, previously wide-eyed, now nodded in approval at the airline's decisive action. Julia emerged from the cockpit, head bowed, clutching a letter of apology in trembling hands. Richard stood beside Harriet, offering a discreet nod of solidarity. He motioned for Julia to step forward. Under the bright overhead lights, Julia approached Harriet's row. Each step seemed to echo like a drumbeat of atonement. She stopped just beyond the rope. The entire cabin held its breath. Julia lifted her chin and met Harriet's steady gaze. Her voice wavered but carried clearly. "Mrs. Washington, I apologize for my actions. I accused you wrongly, insulted you, and tore your ticket in front of everyone. I was blinded by my own biases. I am deeply sorry." A hush fell over the cabin. Harriet felt her throat tighten, not with anger but with empathy. She nodded once, acknowledging Julia's courage to apologize in public. "Thank you," she said, her voice gentle. "I accept your apology. May this moment remind us all that respect is earned and never assumed." A ripple of applause began at the back of the cabin and slowly spread forward. Julia's eyes filled with tears one last time before she turned and walked back to the galley, the verdict of the crew's sympathetic gazes weighing on her. The announcement for final boarding crackled over the loudspeaker. Engines hummed as the aircraft prepared for pushback. Harriet felt the vibration under her seat as the captain began taxiing toward runway 4 right. Outside the window, she saw the line of jets stretching across the tarmac, their wings glinting in the afternoon sun. A deep sense of closure settled in her chest. She had faced prejudice at 35 miles per hour on a speeding conveyor belt of humanity and refused to be diminished. As the plane accelerated to takeoff speed, Harriet closed her eyes and remembered the jolt of injustice when Julia's palm connected with her hand. She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She had transformed humiliation into accountability. She had made the airline's leadership answer for its culture. She had shown every person in first class that dignity cannot be torn apart like paper tickets. It endures and commands respect. After seating herself, Harriet reached into her leather purse for her notebook. She jotted a few lines toward the op-ed she planned to submit to the New York Times upon landing. She wrote about the quiet power of composure, the necessity of empathy training, and the responsibility of corporations to uphold equality. Notes filled the page in neat script. She closed the notebook and set it aside, content that this chapter of her life would resonate far beyond the cabin walls. Down the aisle, flight attendants moved with renewed purpose. One refilled Harriet's glass with ice water, 32 degrees Fahrenheit chilled. Another offered her a warm blanket. Passengers leaned back in their seats, some murmuring praise, others sharing videos on their phones with hashtags like respect at 35K. Harriet allowed herself a moment to absorb the collective relief and solidarity that had blossomed from an ugly confrontation. Hours later, when the aircraft descended through low-hanging clouds toward LAX, Harriet gazed out at the sprawling city lights. She reflected on how quickly a moment of cruelty could become a catalyst for systemic change. She knew the disciplinary hearing would set a precedent across the industry. She felt proud that her insistence on dignity had led to concrete action, mandatory bias training, formal apologies, and new policies to protect travelers. Upon touchdown, the cabin lights glowed warmly as passengers unbuckled and stretched. Harriet stood, sliding her cane onto the floor as she made her way down the aisle. Strangers reached out to shake her hand, thanking her for her bravery. A young woman in the row ahead whispered through tears, "You remind me of my late mother." Harriet squeezed her hand gently. "We all deserve to be treated with kindness," she replied. In the arrivals hall, reporters had gathered. Harriet paused under the neon sign reading "International Arrivals" and spoke into a camera's microphone. "Today we learned that prejudice can thrive anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. It is our duty to challenge it, to demand respect, and to extend compassion to every person we meet." Flashes popped as she delivered her statement with dignity. Julia's gaze flickered to the floor, shame coloring her cheeks. She realized that until that moment, she had cared only about protocol and privilege, never once pausing to see Harriet as a person deserving of basic respect. Tears welled in her eyes as Harriet waited, unwavering. Harriet's question had pierced deep, not as an accusation but as an invitation to confront one's own prejudices. After what felt like an eternity, Julia raised her head, voice barely more than a whisper. "No, I would not," she admitted. "I was wrong. I see now that I would never have apologized if you were not someone of great status." Her confession hung in the air, raw and painful. Behind her, flight attendants and passengers shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in understanding, others casting sidelong glances at one another, recognizing their own silent judgments. Harriet nodded slowly, a flicker of compassion softening her stern expression. "Then you understand why this mattered," she said gently. "Dignity and respect are not tokens granted by position or wealth. They are birthrights of every human being, regardless of how they look or what they own." The cabin remained silent, the lesson sinking in. Just as the tension began to ease, Richard Montgomery rose from his seat beside Harriet. His normally stoic features had softened during Harriet's address, but now his eyes regained that firm decisiveness. "Miss Monroe," he said, "we appreciate your apology, and I trust you have learned much today. However, words alone are not enough. Actions must follow. Therefore, for the remainder of this flight, you will personally serve Mrs. Washington, attending to her every need. Consider it a demonstration of true service and humility." A murmur of approval swept through the cabin. The idea of symbolic restitution felt just and appropriate. Julia's head dropped lower still, her uniform pristine but her spirit battered. She inclined her head without protest. "Yes, sir," she murmured. At that moment she realized that serving Harriet Washington was not punishment in the traditional sense, but an opportunity to learn empathy and to atone for every moment she had ever looked down on another human being. From then on, every time Julia approached Harriet, she did so with deliberate care. When Harriet requested an extra blanket, Julia measured the temperature 68 degrees Fahrenheit at the cabin thermostat and arranged it neatly across the seat back. When Harriet asked for a glass of Earl Grey tea, Julia monitored the water at precisely 200 degrees Fahrenheit to ensure proper steeping. Each movement was slow, respectful, yet laden with the weight of Julia's own awakening conscience. At one point, Harriet looked up at Julia and asked quietly, "Have you ever served someone in this way before?" Julia shook her head, tears glistening. "No, never," she whispered. Harriet offered a small smile. "Then perhaps this is the most important lesson you will ever learn about service." Julia's shoulders trembled, but she met Harriet's gaze and nodded. Harriet took a delicate sip of her tea, the lemon slice floating like a pale sun in the cup. She savored it, not for the flavor but for the reminder that kindness could be gentle yet firm. She set the cup down and looked out the window at the endless stretch of clouds below. "Do you remember how you felt when you first saw me in the VIP lounge?" she asked. Julia paused, the tray of fresh fruit suspended in her hands. "I felt suspicious. I felt that you didn't belong," Julia admitted, voice cracking. "Suspicion," Harriet said, "is often just fear in disguise. Fear of difference, fear of what we do not understand. When we let that fear guide our actions, we harm not only others, but ourselves." Julia swallowed, tears slipping down her cheeks, unnoticed by most except the flight attendant standing nearby, who offered a sympathetic glance. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, listening intently to this quiet exchange. Among them, Sebastian Hartley and Abigail Miller shared a glance of profound respect for Harriet and a shared recognition of their own complicity when they had once judged silently. They saw in Julia's trembling form both the consequences of prejudice and the possibility of redemption. After a few more requests, a fresh bottle of water, a warmed towel to freshen Harriet's hands, Julia performed her tasks with meticulous attention. Each act of service was a silent apology, a step toward undoing the damage of her earlier cruelty. With every measured movement, Julia felt the tight coils of her arrogance loosen, replaced by a tenderness she had never known. Harriet observed quietly, acknowledging Julia's efforts with a slight nod or a gentle "Thank you, Julia." Those simple words carried far more weight than the harshest reprimand. They conveyed forgiveness, dignity, and a belief in Julia's capacity to change. As the flight continued, the atmosphere in first class transformed. The initial tension gave way to a reflective calm. Conversations restarted, but now they revolved around the power of compassion and the necessity of confronting one's biases. Strangers exchanged stories of moments when they, too, had unfairly judged another and how they had grown from their mistakes. By the time the aircraft began its descent, engines winding down from cruise speed of 560 miles per hour to taxi pace, Julia had served Harriet countless times. Each tray delivered and each request fulfilled had chipped away at her self-righteousness. She no longer felt the sharp sting of humiliation as keenly because she understood the lesson it carried. When the seatbelt sign dinged on, signaling landing, Julia returned the last tray to the galley, paused in the doorway of Harriet's row, and spoke softly. "Mrs. Washington, I want you to know that I will never forget today. I will carry this lesson with me always." Her voice was steady, sincere, the tremor replaced by resolve. Harriet smiled warmly. "That is all I could ever ask, Julia. May we both continue to grow in kindness and fairness no matter where we go." With that, Harriet returned her attention to the window, watching the city lights of Los Angeles appear through the thinning veil of clouds. When the plane touched down, the applause that greeted Harriet as she stood to deplane was heartfelt. Passengers rose to their feet, some offering tears, others offering hugs. Julia followed behind Harriet, transformed from the moment her pride had shattered. She felt genuine gratitude toward the woman she had once scorned. In the arrivals hall, cameras and reporters awaited. Harriet paused beneath the "Welcome to Los Angeles" sign. She adjusted her scarf, silk in a shade of deep emerald that matched her unwavering spirit, and spoke to the microphones. "Today we witness the courage it takes to stand against prejudice, to admit our mistakes, and to embrace empathy. May we carry this spirit with us, on every street and in every office, so that dignity becomes our default with every person we meet." As Harriet spoke, Julia stood nearby, her head bowed but smiling in quiet solidarity. Passengers lined the hall, cheering and nodding. Tears glistened in Julia's eyes, not of shame, but of determination to live differently. In the days that followed, the airline implemented new policies, mandatory bias training, peer-to-peer reflection workshops, and forums where customers and crew could share experiences. Julia Monroe became a trainer herself, speaking candidly about how one moment of cruelty had nearly ended her career, and how one moment of compassion had transformed her life. Harriet Washington returned to her work as chairwoman with renewed purpose. She launched an initiative called Dignity in the Sky, partnering with hospitality programs to promote respectful service nationwide. She penned an essay in a leading magazine. Her words of that afternoon captured for posterity. Respect is not measured by our titles, but by our actions. We all share the responsibility to honor each other's worth. Months later, at an industry conference, Julia took the stage beside Harriet. She introduced herself not as a flight attendant forced into atonement, but as someone reborn through empathy. She spoke of the heavy lesson she had learned in first class and urged her colleagues to see every passenger as a human before a protocol. Harriet looked on with pride, the same steely grace she had shown that day at Gate 22, now tempered by the warmth of community and progress. The audience rose in applause, not for her status, but for the universal truth she embodied, that no matter where we sit in life, we all deserve respect and the chance to learn from our mistakes. And so, the story of Harriet Washington and Julia Monroe became more than an airport incident. It became a movement, a reminder that every person carries a story, that every act of kindness can shatter a legacy of prejudice, and that the most powerful gestures are those born of genuine understanding. In the sky and on the ground, in boardrooms and break rooms, the echoes of that flight lived on, urging each of us to hold firm to compassion, to stand tall in the face of injustice, and to serve one another with unyielding dignity. Julia Monroe's heart pounded as she followed the two security officers down the narrow hallway, the hard soles of her shoes echoing on the linoleum tile. She had endured public humiliation at 35,000 feet, but nothing prepared her for this. The strategic meeting room, executive board, a place reserved for only the most serious incidents, and she was the center of one. The brass plaque on the door gleamed under the fluorescent light, announcing her worst fears. Inside, the room was cold and stark. A long mahogany table stretched from end to end, surrounded by rigid leather chairs. At the head sat James Whitaker, the chief operating officer, his gray hair impeccably styled and his posture as rigid as the company policies he upheld. Beside him, Stephen Caldwell, the vice president who had confronted Julia in the cockpit, scrolled through his tablet, his jaw tight with disappointment. The dossier labeled Flight 934 Incident, allegations of severe racial discrimination, lay thick on the table, its pages filled with eyewitness statements and video stills. Julia's uniform felt stifling. She forced herself to stand tall, hands clenched at her sides, as James Whitaker looked up. Ms. Monroe, we have gathered statements from passengers, crew reports, and security footage. Before we proceed to a decision, do you have anything to say? His voice was calm but carried the weight of authority that brooked no excuses. She swallowed hard, the cool air in the room suddenly harsh against her throat. The faces around her waited, expressionless yet expectant. She realized there was no hiding, no deflecting. She lifted her chin and spoke, voice trembling but growing steadier with each word. I admit my actions were wholly unacceptable. I allowed prejudice to guide my behavior. I insulted a passenger, tore her ticket, and humiliated her in front of hundreds. That was a terrible mistake, and I am deeply sorry. A hush fell. Even Stephen Caldwell's stern features softened in surprise. Julia's confession was unprecedented, an admission of bias spoken without a lawyer's prodding or a union representative at her side. She drew in a shaky breath and continued. I understand the gravity of what I've done. I'm prepared to face any disciplinary action, even termination, because I know I betrayed the trust placed in me. James Whitaker exchanged a glance with Caldwell, then folded his hands over the dossier. We appreciate your candor, he said. We will convene a disciplinary board within 24 hours. For now, you are suspended without pay and your airline credentials are revoked. You will also attend mandatory racial awareness training." He paused, letting the implications settle over Julia like a freezing mist. Julia nodded, relief mingling with dread. Relief that she had faced her wrongdoing, dread at the uncertain path ahead. She bowed her head, lips pressed tight to hold back tears. She sensed this was not the end, but the beginning of a journey that would demand every ounce of humility she had left. Before she could thank them or ask questions, the door opened. Every head in the room turned. Julia's breath caught as a figure entered with measured grace, Harriet Washington, the airline's founder and chairwoman, stepping into the room as if she belonged to royalty. Harriet's silver hair was swept into a neat chignon. Her tailored charcoal gray suit hung on her frame with understated elegance. She carried herself with the poise of someone who had built an empire on her own terms. The room felt smaller in her presence. James Whitaker rose from his seat, followed by Caldwell and the other board members. Harriet offered a slight nod to Julia, her dark eyes steady, piercing. No hint of anger shone there, only an unwavering resolve. "Good afternoon," Harriet began, her voice rich and clear, resonating against the walls. "I understand you are deliberating Miss Monroe's fate. May I speak?" She did not wait for permission. The council naturally yielded. Harriet's entrance had shifted the dynamic entirely. The board members sat in stunned silence, weighing Harriet's proposal against the usual course of action. Firing Julia would be swift, uncomplicated. Training her would be complex, risky, but potentially far more impactful. Finally, Stephen Caldwell cleared his throat. "Chairwoman Washington, with all due respect, are you certain this is the right approach? Some may see this as leniency." Harriet's gaze remained unflinching. "I do not need retribution. I need to build a system that transforms, not just removes, those who misguidedly harm it. This airline stands for connection, inclusivity, and respect. We must embody those values even when it is hardest." One by one, the board members nodded. James Whitaker exhaled and tapped the dossier decisively. "Then it is settled. Ms. Monroe will undergo 6 months of re-education supervised by Chairwoman Washington, culminating in a board review for potential reinstatement. We will also establish a new Ethics and Conduct Evaluation Council to oversee cases like this in the future. This incident must catalyze lasting reform." Julia sank into a chair, relief and gratitude mingling in her chest. She met Harriet's eyes and saw no triumph there, only the compassionate determination of someone who refused to let prejudice win. Harriet smiled gently at Julia, an acknowledgement of the painful work ahead. "Ms. Monroe, I know this will be challenging, but I believe you can emerge from this a better person, and I promise you will have my support." After the meeting, Julia left the room escorted by a junior manager. She walked through the silent hallway, each step lighter than the last. She had faced her darkest selfishness and found in herself a seed of regret and now a path to redemption. Throughout it all, Harriet made surprise visits to the training room. She observed quietly, offering gentle feedback, sometimes sharing her own experiences of being underestimated as a woman in a male-dominated industry. She spoke not as a judge, but as a mentor who understood the stinging burden of bias. Julia listened, absorbing each lesson with humility. By the end of the 6 months, Julia had transformed. She co-facilitated a workshop at the airline's annual leadership summit, speaking candidly about the consequences of prejudice and the power of compassion. Executives gave her a standing ovation. Harriet, seated in the front row, felt pride that went beyond corporate success. It was the pride of witnessing genuine human growth. On a crisp autumn morning, the board convened one final time to evaluate Julia's progress. They reviewed her reports, her workshop feedback, and the sharp decrease in reported incidents at first-class cabins. Members praised the restructuring of training protocols and the effectiveness of the new Ethics Council. When asked for a recommendation, the council unanimously voted to reinstate Julia Monroe as a flight attendant, contingent on continued mentorship and ongoing reflection assignments. Julia knelt before the council in gratitude, her voice steady as she thanked them. She promised to uphold the airline's values and to never again allow fear or prejudice to guide her actions. Harriet rose and offered her hand, not as a superior granting mercy, but as a fellow human celebrating renewal. Julia grasped it firmly, eyes shining with determination. A week later, Julia Monroe returned to Gate 22, this time as a newly appointed diversity ambassador among the flight staff. She approached passengers with genuine warmth, greeting travelers of every background with open curiosity and respect. She guided an elderly gentleman in a wheelchair, helped a Hispanic mother with her stroller, and offered a warm smile to a black businesswoman boarding alone. In every gesture, she demonstrated the lessons she had learned. Evelyn Washington, observing from first class 1A, tapped her cane lightly on the floor in approval. She watched Julia with pride, the same quiet pride she had once felt for herself when she boarded that morning. Harriet's own journey, from a young woman blending in at JFK to a powerful CEO, had taught her that real leadership means lifting others up, even when it demands more than mere retribution. And as her private jet taxied alongside the commercial terminal that afternoon, Harriet Washington allowed herself a rare, satisfied smile. She had turned a moment of cruelty into a catalyst for systemic change. She had rescued not only her own dignity, but given another person the chance to redeem theirs. In the end, the highest altitude of all was reached, not in the sky, but in the human heart. Harriet Washington fixed Julia Monroe with a steady gaze. You will have to prove that you can help build a future where no one faces racial discrimination on our flights. This is your one chance. If you fail, there will be no second opportunity. The words cut through the hush of the board meeting room like a winter breeze. Julia's breath caught. She understood that this was not merely a suspension or training program. It was an ultimatum that challenged the very core of her beliefs, a gauntlet thrown down by a woman she had once disrespected in the cruelest way. Julia's legs trembled as she dropped into the nearest chair. Tears pricked her eyes, not because she had escaped firing, but because she had been entrusted with a task she felt unworthy to undertake. Harriet's nod was slight but unwavering, her silver hair reflecting the late afternoon light through frosted windows. "I don't need your gratitude," Harriet said quietly. "I need you to overcome yourself." The silence that followed was no longer oppressive. It was a moment pregnant with possibility, the start of a transformation that would test Julia's courage and conviction. When the council members filed out, leaving only Harriet and Julia, the room seemed to expand, its walls empty of judgment but filled with expectation. Harriet sank into the chair by the window, the glow of dusk filtering through textured glass. She offered no instructions, only that calm presence that had unsettled Julia from the first slap. Almost instinctively, Julia pulled out a chair opposite Harriet, her back rigid, hands clenched into fists of regret. Harriet studied Julia for a long moment before she spoke in her trademark warm tone. "When you tore that ticket from my hand, I didn't just feel anger. I felt exhaustion. The exhaustion of a lifetime spent proving I belong." Julia swallowed, her eyes flicking to the floor. The shame of every time she had judged someone by their appearance rose like bile in her throat. Harriet's voice softened. "I remember the first time I was denied boarding, even though I held a valid ticket. I was in economy, not first class, but I dreamed about that seat for weeks." Julia glanced up, a single tear escaping down her cheek. Harriet continued, "They told me my name wasn't in the system and called security to escort me out. all because I was a young black woman in worn clothes among white passengers. Julia's face crumpled as she realized the depth of Harriet's pain. The room's hush deepened, broken only by Harriet's quiet confession. "I do not share this seeking your pity," she said, voice firm but gentle. "I share it so you understand why this matters." Julia nodded, feeling the weight of Harriet's story settle in her bones. She bowed her head and whispered, "I'm sorry, I never knew." Harriet leaned forward, gaze piercing yet compassionate. "Julia, I didn't fire you because vengeance was too easy. I need you to face your biases, learn from them, and use your experience to prevent others from walking the same path." The words were a hammer striking the last vestiges of Julia's self-righteousness. In mid-training, role-playing exercises forced Julia into uncomfortable scenarios. She had to confront her own unconscious bias when asked to serve simulated passengers wearing casual clothing. When she hesitated, the facilitator paused the simulation and asked Julia to examine why she assumed that attire signaled lower status. Julia blinked back tears, realizing how casually she had judged based on Disneyland t-shirts or wrinkled khakis. By the 4th month, Julia and her cohort delved into the history of racism in America. They learned about redlining, Jim Crow laws, mass incarceration, and how systemic discrimination permeates everything from housing to healthcare. Data charts showed income disparities and life expectancy gaps measured in years. Julia's stomach churned as she saw how layered and insidious prejudice could be, thriving like a slow-growing cancer in society's roots. In the final month, Julia was tasked with designing a workshop for new hires. She crafted scenarios, prepared handouts, and created reflective prompts that challenged participants to share their own biases. Under Harriet Washington's guidance, she practiced delivering the session to company leadership, fielding hard questions, and learning to listen without defensiveness. For the first time, Julia felt a spark of purpose. 6 months later, Julia returned to the CEO's conference room, heart pounding. She handed Harriet a bound report detailing every assignment she completed, every workshop she co-led, and every personal revelation she had experienced. Harriet read through the pages, her dark eyes moving deliberately across each line. Finally, she looked up. "Do you think you've changed?" she asked. Julia took a deep breath. This was not a test, but an opportunity to speak her truth. "I don't think I've changed enough," she said. "I've only begun to see what I chose not to see before. I know I must continue learning and unlearning every day." Harriet's lips curved into a small, approving smile. "That is enough for today," she said, "but not enough for a lifetime. Keep going." That afternoon, Julia stood before a group of new flight attendants in their first training session. The room was bright, the air thick with nervous energy. Julia's voice was steady as she began. "Remember, every passenger carries more than luggage. They carry stories, invisible wounds. Never be the person who makes them feel they don't belong." She watched young faces nod and felt something close to joy bloom in her chest. Later, as the sun dipped low, Harriet Washington boarded her private jet for a late evening departure. She glanced over at the gate, where Julia Monroe directed a young man in a wheelchair with genuine kindness. Harriet allowed herself a rare, satisfied smile. She had demanded change, not through punishment, but through compassion, planting a seed that had grown into something far beyond a single life. In the end, the highest altitude is reached not by climbing above the clouds, but by lifting others up. And sometimes, that is all we need to turn pain into progress and genuine healing. What about you? If you stood in Harriet Washington's shoes, could you find it in your heart to forgive someone who once tormented you and offer them a path to change? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to know how you cultivate compassion in your own life. If this story resonated with you, please like, share with those who need encouragement, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss our next inspiring narrative. Thank you for joining us on this journey.